Hi everyone. Welcome back to Goodnight Stories. My name is Lyra, and I will be your guide into whatever book we decide to read tonight. From young readers to young adult novels, my hope is to give you a comfortable space to listen to a story. So, sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea. Tonight we jump back into Kathryn Lasky's The Rescue, the third book of the Guardians of Ga'Hoole series. My book is sadly falling apart because it's so old. Chapter 5. Bubbo's Forge. Soren had been back for 2 days, but he had said nothing to his strange experience in the spirit woods to anyone, not even his closest friends, his friends in the band, Gylfie, Digger, Twilight, himself, and now, since her rescue, his sister Eglantine. But every day when he fell to sleep he dreamed of the scrooms of his parents. Had it been a dream in the spirit woods as well, just a dream? And the words metal beak, those two words seemed to almost clang in his brain and send ominous quivers to his gizzard. The words took on a life of their own and grew more dreadful with each passing hour. Something spooky, you Sword, I just know it, Digger said as they were sitting in the library one evening after navigation practice. No, nothing at all, Soren said quickly. Soren had been reading a really good book, but he was distracted and had read the same sentence about 5 times. Leave it to Digger to pick up on the worries that haunted him day and night. Nothing at all, Soren? Digger blinked and looked at him closely. The fluffy white brow tufts that framed his deep yellow eyes waggled a bit. Soren looked back at Digger. Should I tell him about the scrooms? About Metalbeak? The best thing is to be honest, yet... Digger, something is bothering me, but I can't tell you just now. Do you understand? Digger blinked again. Of course, Soren. When you're ready to tell, I'll listen, the burrowing owl said softly. No need to say anything until you're ready. Thank you, Digger. Thank you so much. So the barn owl got up, closed the book he was reading, and went to put it on the shelf. The shelf was next to the table where Easelribe always sat, absorbed in his studies, munching on his little pile of dried caterpillars. The library wasn't the same without the old screech owl. Nothing seemed the same without him. Soren slid the book back into its place on the shelf. As he turned to leave, a book on metals caught his eye. Metals? Why hadn't he thought of this before? He must go to see Bubbo, the blacksmith. He must immediately go to Bubbo's forge. Soren might not be ready to tell Digger, but he was ready to tell Bubbo. Not all of it, but part of it. The part about Metalbeak. He flew out of the great Ga'Hoole tree, spiraled down toward its base, and then swept low across the ground to a nearby cave. This was Bubbo's forge. The forge was just outside the entry of the cave, and the rock had been blackened over the years from Bubbo's fires. It was to this forge that Soren and the other members of the colouring shaw brought the live coals that fed the fires, which smelted the metals used for everything from pots and pans to battle claws and shields for the great tree. If anyone knew about Metalbeaks, well, or whatever it was that the scrooms had spoken of in the whispery voices that still swirled in Soren's head, it would be Bubbo. The fire had been dampened down, however, there was no sign of Bubbo. Perhaps he was inside. Although Bubbo was not a burrowing owl, who always made their nests in the ground, he preferred living in a cave to a tree, and he had once explained to Soren, blacksmiths like himself, no matter if they were great horned owls, snowies, spotted, or great greys, were drawn to the earth where, indeed, the metals lodged. Soren now stepped into the shadow of the overhanging rock ledge of the cave's opening. Deep inside, he could see the glints of the whirly glasses that Bubbo had strung up. These contraptions were made from bits of colored glass, and when light crept into the cave and struck the glass, reflections spun through the air and bounced off the walls in swirling dapples of color. There was no moonlight tonight, though. It was the time of the dwinking, when the moon disappeared to barely a sliver. Bubbo, Soren called. He waited. Bubbo. That you, Soren? That you, Soren? A large shadowy bundle of feathers started to melt out of the darkness of the cave. Great horned owls like Bubbo were large, but Bubbo himself was unusually large and towered over Soren. His two ear tufts, which grew straight up over each eye, were exceedingly bushy, giving him a slightly threatening demeanor. But Soren knew that beneath the gruffness there was no owl who had a gentler heart than Bubbo. Although, like most great horned owls, his feathers were basically the dull somber grays, browns, and blacks. They had been shot through with bright red and hot yellow like the hottest of fires, the one said to have bonk. Bonk was the word that blacksmiths like Bubbo used to describe the strongest and most energetic fires. Such fires have special hues and colors, unlike ordinary ones. Bubbo also could be said to have bonking colorful plumage. It was as if he had been clothed in the flames of his own forge, instead of just the usual drab feathers of his species. "What brings you here, lad?" "Metalbeak," Soren blurted without preamble. "Metalbeak?" Bubbo gasped. "What you know about him, laddie?" "Him," Soren blinked. "It's a him?" Until that moment, Soren thought that the screams of his parents had been referring to a thing, something that struck dread in him like Flex. Yes, he had suspected Flex because it was Bubbo himself who had first explained to him that the flex they had been forced to pick at St. Aggie's were a kind of special metal with what he called magnetic properties. He had said that when all the tiny unseeable parts, the flecks in these metals, were lined up, it created a force that was called magnetic. Now Soren didn't know what to think. He was relieved that Metalbeak had nothing to do with Flex, but why was Bubbo so agitated? The big, flaming horned owl was almost hopping out of his feathers. "You stay clear of him. You ain't to go tangling with that owl, Soren. Metalbeak is an owl." "Oh, yes." "What kind?" No one is for sure what kind he is. A bad kind, that's all I can tell you." Soren was confused. How could you not be sure about what kind he is? "Because he wears a metal beak and a metal mask over most of his face." "Why's that?" "Wouldn't really know," Bubbo said, as if he didn't really want to discuss it. "Some say he flies noisy, like a pygmy owl, but he ain't no pygmy size, I'll tell you that. Well, maybe barn owl, but bigger, much bigger, but not as big as a great grey. Some swear he's got ear tufts like a great horned, yours truly here. Others say no. But there's one thing they all agree on." "What's that?" Bubbo's voice dropped. "He's the most brutal owl in all the kingdoms of owls. He's the most vicious owl on earth." Soren swore that he felt his gizzard drop to his talons. When Soren and his band had been on their journey to the great Gahul tree, they had come across a dying barred owl. To Soren and his mates it looked like a murder by St. Aggie's top lieutenants. "Was it St. Aggie's?" Gylfi had asked, and the dying barred owl had responded with his last breath. "I wish it had been St. Aggie's. It was something far worse. Believe me, St. Aggie's. Oh, you only wish." Soren, Gylfi, Twilight, and Digger could not imagine anything worse, anything more brutal than St. Aggie's, but the barred owl had told them differently. There was something far worse. It was nameless and now possibly faceless, but so frightened were the four owls that they had begun to refer to this monster, or possibly monsters, as the "you only wish." The few times they had begun to ask about this evil thing, the owls of the Gahul tree, the Ribes, had deftly turned the conversation to something else. But now Bubbo was telling him of this brutal owl known as Metalbeak. Bubbo would never turn away from a young owl's question. That simply wasn't his style. So Soren did not feel reluctant to press him. "You know, Bubbo, how Gylfi, Digger, Twilight, and I found that dying barred owl in the beaks?" "Yes, I heard tell of that in the bobcat that you four young'uns managed to kill right stylishly, I'd say. Dropped a coal in his eye, direct hit from how far up was it?" "Oh, I'm not sure, Bubbo, but tell me this. Do you think that the barred owl might have been done in by this Metalbeak?" "Very possible, possible indeed, maybe even probable, which, as you know, is, if you study your arithmetic, can happen more often than possible. In other words, probable is more possible than possible." Yes, of course, Bubbo could go off in this way, and it could be very difficult to get him back on track. "I see what you mean, but why would it be very possible, or maybe even probable, that this Metalbeak killed the barred owl?" "Well, the barred owl was a rogue smith, warn't he? But it really wasn't a question. Soren wasn't quite sure if he understood Bubbo's meaning. It was as if Bubbo was saying that if an owl was a rogue smith, this sometimes could happen. Yes, Soren said hesitantly, but what? Well, Bubbo, I'm not exactly sure what a rogue smith is. Don't you know what a rogue smith is? Don't know what a rogue smith is, don't you? Soren shook his head and looked down at his talons. Nothing to be ashamed about, lad. A rogue smith is a blacksmith just like me. But he ain't attached to any kingdom. I mean, we here at the Gahul Tree be the only ones who know how to use fire in all different ways, like for cooking and the light for candles, for reading, and of course for tools, like battle claws and pots and pans and cauldrons. But these rogue smiths, they know about forging some, and they mostly make battle claws. Weapons, you know. But who do they make them for? Anyone who comes along. They don't ask no questions about the who, but it seems like they get plenty of information one way or another. They have to deal with the rogue colliers, getting a lot from them. Rogue colliers? You mean colliers like me and Odalissa and Martin and Ruby? Yep, but no chaw. You get it? They're just go it alone. Alone into forest fires. Bubbo nodded, but it's the smiths who really get all the good information. This barred owl was a slipgizzle. Yes, Soren replied. Now you know what a slipgizzle is, don't you? Kind of a secret agent owl? That's it, basically. Keeps their eyes and ears open for any news, then reports back to us, but they never stay long when they come. They likes living wild. I think I recall this barred owl coming in here once a while back. A rough trade sort of bird. Didn't like his meat cooked, no siree. Said candlelight and smell of wax wobbled his gizzard. Are there any other rogue smiths? Soren asked. An idea was forming in his head. Oh, yes, a few. There's a snowy owl over near the border between the Barrens and Silvervale. Do you know his name? Soren asked. His. What makes you think it's a he? Hers? Soren asked tentatively. Bubbo nodded. I've never heard a female blacksmith. Well, now you have. Bubbo batted his talon on one of the whirly glasses, and the colors seemed to ignite as they were caught in the light of a candle dappling the walls of the cave. What's her name? Soren asked. Don't know. Most of them rogue smiths keep their names to themselves. They're an odd sort, I'm telling you. Then he looked narrowly at Soren and fixed him in his amber gaze. Rogues are unpredictable, and not only that, they are often visited by bad sorts. After all, they make weapons, so Soren, don't you go getting any ideas. But that was exactly what Soren was doing, getting an idea. Chapter 6. Eglintine's Dilemma. Beware of Metalbeak. It was the Scrooms who told me. Soren was in the hollow with Twilight, Gylfie, Digger, and Eglantine. But did they actually say it out loud? Gylfie hopped up close to Soren and looked straight up. Well, no, not exactly. Scrooms don't speak out loud. Then how do you know, Eglantine asked in a broken voice, that it was them, the Scrooms of Mum and Da? Because if it was, that means they're dead. Doesn't it, Soren? Tears began to leak out of his sister's coal black eyes. It does, Eglantine. There's nothing we can do about that, said Soren. Dead is dead, Twilight said in his usual blunt way. Gylfie turned and kicked him with his talons. What'd you do that for, Gylfie? Twilight, she has just found out for sure that her parents are dead. You could be a little more sensitive. But it's the truth, isn't? Twilight said, slightly abashed by Gylfie's reprimand. It is. It is, and it isn't, Soren said. You asked me how I heard them, how I could be sure. I can't explain exactly. It was them. I felt their spirits, and their words were not out-loud words, but seemed to form in my brain. First, they would come like fog or mist, and then they would gather into a shape that had meaning, a picture, but I felt so close to them, I knew it was them. Digger now spoke. Well, why do you say that it is? And it is true that they are dead, Sword. Miss Plithiver told me that one reason the Scrooms of Owls do not go to Glamora is because they have unfinished business on Earth. I think Ma and Dad's unfinished business was to warn me about Metalbeak. We must find this Metalbeak, and I think that the best way is to go to the roguesmith of Silvervale. But we can't, Soren, Eglantine said in an almost whiny voice. I have navigation and Gohology, and they really get mad at us new owls if we skip class, especially the Gohology tribe. She says that these are the most important days for the tree. Gohology was the study and care of the great tree, which not only gave habitat to the owls of Gahul, but nourishment through its nuts and berries. Indeed, there was hardly a part of the tree that was not used in some way. Yes, but the berry harvest is coming up, Soren said. So, said Eglantine. It's a big festival. Gylfi turned to Eglantine. There are no child practices or classes for 3 days. We all have to help with the harvest, and then on the third night there's a big banquet that goes on every night for another 3 or 4 at least to celebrate. They say the Ribes always get very tipsy on milkberry wine. It'll be the easiest time to fly off with no one noticing. Oh, said Eglantine. She sounded slightly deflated, as if some last hope had vanished for her. So when does this festival start? 5 days, Digger said. 5 days? Eglantine sounded panicked. Yes, said Soren, but we shouldn't plan to leave until after the banquet is really going. The banquets don't begin for another 8 days. Yes, everyone agreed. They began making plans immediately. Should it just be the 5 of them, or should they include others like Martin and Ruby? Soren felt it might be a good idea because colliers knew the ways of smiths and other colliers, and quite honestly, Soren realized he did not want to take on the entire burden with the rogue smith. She might prove difficult. He wondered to himself if Eglantine was really strong enough to go yet. She seemed still frail to him, even though it had been almost 2 months since her rescue. Not just physically frail, but frail in the gizzard. Then again, would her feelings be hurt if she were left behind? What about Otalissa? Gylfi asked. There was a resounding no. She can't keep her beak shut, said Twilight. Right, said Digger. She'll be hooted about it all over the tree. I can come, can't I, Soren? Eglantine asked in a small, tremulous voice. Do you feel strong enough? Of course I do. Soren didn't have the heart to say no. Then another thought suddenly occurred to him. You know, all this time I've been thinking that this Metalbeak, whoever he is, might be the one who killed the barred owl. Do you suppose that it was as if the 3 owls, Twilight, Digger, and Gylfi, all read Soren's mind? Easelribe, they all gasped. Exactly. Do you think Metalbeak could have something to do with Easelribe's disappearance? The owls began whispering in excited voices. We must work out a strategy, Gylfi said. We better go to the library look at maps of Silvervale, Digger added. Well, Bubbo said the rogue smith was on the border between Silvervale and the Barrens, so doesn't that mean it could be either place? Soren asked. But they call her the rogue smith of Silvervale, Gylfi said, so most likely she is closer to Silvervale. There were countless details to work out. Should they borrow battle claws from the armory? No, they would be found out immediately, even if the older owls were tipsy. Could they leave any earlier? What weather was coming in? If it was a south wind, and they were flying south by southeast, it could slow them down. Amid all this jabber, there was one little pocket of silence, and that was when Eglantine retreated to her own corner of the hollow, and tried to weep as silently as possible in the fluffy nest of down. But it wasn't her mum's down. It didn't smell anything like her mum, and there was too much moss in it. But she couldn't let Soren see her crying. She had just told him that she was strong enough to fly with them to Silvervale. She wanted to be included so much. They mustn't think she was a baby. Well, there was only one place to go when she was feeling this bad, to Miss Plithiver. She hoped Miss P's hollow mates, 2 other nestmate snakes, wouldn't be there. It would be all over the tree if they saw her crying. Nestmates were notorious gossips. There, dear. Miss Plithiver had coiled up and was stretching as far as possible to stroke Eglantine's wing. It can't be that bad. But it is, Miss P. You don't understand. No, I don't. Why don't you start at the beginning? So Eglantine told the old nestmaid snake about what Soren had seen in the spirit forest, about the scrooms of their parents, and how Twilight had said dead is dead, but Soren had said not exactly, and the part about Metalbeak and the unfinished business. See, Miss P, I know this is wrong, but if the business gets finished, Mom and Dad will go to Glamora, and then I'll never see them again. Miss Plithiver was silent for a long time. If she had had eyes, they might have wept. Finally she spoke. It's not wrong, Eglantine, to want to see your parents again. But the real question is, would you be happy if you saw them, or their scrooms, and they were very, very sad and worried about you? Eglantine blinked. She hadn't thought of that. Was Soren happy? Miss P continued. Did he say anything about being so happy and glad to have seen them? Now that Eglantine thought about it, Soren hadn't seemed at all happy since he had returned from the spirit woods. He seemed completely dragged down by something, and Miss Plithiver, as if seeing directly into Eglantine's brain, said, The scrooms with unfinished business, although they seem only to be made of mist and vapor, can be a terrible weight on the living. I noticed it as soon as Soren returned. You did? Eglantine blinked in astonishment. Miss P nodded her rose-colored head, and her eye-dents seemed to flinch. How? Eglantine asked. I've told you, Eglantine, that although we are blind, nest-made snakes have very finely tuned sensibilities. We pick up on these things, especially if it concerns family members, and I've worked for your family for a long time. Well, I just know when any one of you is out of sorts. But, Eglantine, the main thing is that you must rid yourself of this notion that to see your parents just one more time, to meet their scrooms, would make you feel happy. It won't, my dear, believe me. It's hard, Eglantine paused. I know. But you know, dear, you must think about the good times you had with your parents, the happy times. Like when Dad would tell us stories of the Order of the Guardian Owls of Gahul before we went to sleep. Nights, he called them. Yes, dear, I listened to his stories too. He had a lovely sonorous voice, especially for a barn owl. But Miss P, Dad thought that the stories were just legends. He didn't know they were true, and that now Soren and I are here, and someday we too shall be guardians of Gahul. If Ma and Dad only knew. Eglantine sighed deeply. But I think they do, dear. That's just the point. Why else would their scrooms have tried to warn Soren? They might have unfinished business, but they knew that you and Soren and Twilight and Digger and Gylfie could finish the business. For you are almost guardians of Gahul, are you not? Well, they are, but not me, yet. Oh, yet, Miss Plithiver swung her head as to wipe away the word. If in your gizzard I know you feel it, and that you are. Really, Miss Plithiver? Really, Eglantine. Eglantine returned to the hollow, feeling much better. Indeed, she was almost excited about their adventure. Chapter 7. The Harvest Festival. At the great Gahul tree there were 4 seasons, beginning in winter with the time of the white rain, then spring, which was known as the time of the silver rain, followed in the summer by the golden rain, and finally the autumn, which was known as the season of the copper rose. The seasons were thus called because of the vines of milkberries that cascaded from every branch of the great tree. The delicious berries of the vines made up a major part of the owls' non-meat diet. For the ripened berries they brewed their tea, and made stews and cakes, loaves of fragrant bread and soup. The dried berries were used for highly nutritious snacks, and as a source of instant energy as well as flavoring for other dishes. Right now, at the time of the copper rose, was when the berries were the ripest and the plumpest for picking. During this time, the owls forsook their usual schedule and even shortened their daytime sleep so they could harvest the strands. The Gahulology Ribe, a burrowing owl known as Dewlap, supervised the harvest. For the past week, they had all been on shifts under her command, cutting lengths of the berry vines just the right way. Remember, young'uns, Dewlap trilled as they flew with the strands of vines in their beaks. No cutting below the 3rd nodule. We must leave something so the vine shall sprout again come the time of silver rain. Soren and his friend Primrose, a pygmy owl, who had been rescued the night that Soren had arrived at the great Gahul tree, were flying together with a vine between them. She's such a bore, sighed Primrose. Aren't you thankful that none of us got the Gahulology shawl? Yes, just don't go into Dewlap's class is bad enough. I was really worried that Eglantine might get the chaw. Never, Primrose said. She's perfect for search and rescue with her fine hearing skills. She's a natural for the chaw, I would say. Soren, of course, could not help but wonder about their own mission to the border between Silverbear and the Barrens, which, if all went according to plan, would begin tonight, just after the last of the vines had been cut. Just then a cheer began to rise, and with the first strains of the harp, a song rang out. It was a solemn song, the harvest hymn, led by Madame Plonk and Dewlap. Dearest tree, we give our thanks for your blessings through the years. Vines heavy with sweet berries nourish us and quench our fears. And in times of summer droughts, searing heat or winter's cold, from your bounty freely given, we grow strong and we grow bold. Let us always tend with care your bark, your roots, your vines so fair. And then suddenly a raucous song blasted out, led by Bubbo. Drink, drink to old Gahool, Baloo, Bala, Baloo, Bala, Bahool. Come along, mates, and give a tipple, how that wine makes gizzards ripple. Just as the song swelled with Bubbo's voice leading, Odalisca swept up beside Soren and Primrose. I can't believe Madame Plonk. She's sashaying about with a rose in her beak and wiggling her tail feathers in the most unseemly fashion. And Dewlap had hardly finished with the hymn before that coarse old owl began his vulgar song, simply appalling. Soren thought if he heard Odalisca say the word appalling one more time, he might crack her on the head. Then that spotted owl would really see spots. But he didn't. Instead, he just turned to her and blinked. Give it a blow, Odalisca. It's a festival for Glox's sake. We can't be singing hymns the whole time. I agree, said Primrose. Who wants a festival to be all serious? I'm hoping to pick up a few wet poop jokes. Why, I never, Odalisca said, genuinely shocked. You know, Primrose, that wet poop jokes are strictly forbidden at meal times. But they say all the grown-ups get very tipsy and start making them themselves. Well, I'm sure Strixstronum won't. Strixstronum, an elderly spotted owl who taught navigation, was one of the most esteemed owls of the tree. She was elegant, she was fierce, and she was revered, especially by Odalisca, who had absolutely worshipped the old spotted owl. It was difficult, in fact, thinking of Strixstronum doing anything the least bit vulgar. The young spotted owl flew off in a huff toward the entrance of the great hollow. As they passed through, two owls helped to part the moss curtains as they had on the night when Soren, Gylfie, Twilight, and Digger had first arrived nearly a year before. Now, however, the great hollow was festooned with strands of milkberry vines that seemed almost to glow in the reflected lights of hundreds of candles. The festivities had already begun, and the owls were swooping in flight to the music of the harp. The great grass harp stood on a balcony and was played by the nest-made snakes who belonged to the Harp Guild. Their pink forms glistened as they wove themselves through the strings of the harp. Soren scanned the strings for Miss P, who was a slip-tween. Only the most talented of snakes were slip-tweens, for they were required to jump octaves. Miss P usually hung around G-flat. Ah, he spotted her. Just then, Odalisca swept by wing to wing, with Strixstronum doing a kind of stately waltz that owls called the Glaucana. Then Bubbo lurched in a jig with Madame Plonk herself. They were budding flight feathers and laughing uproariously. Already had a tipple, I would say. Gylfie slid into flight next to Soren. Soren was dying to say yes, and we better not, for tonight was the night that they would seal away to find the rogue smith, but not until everyone else was in their cups. Their Gahool nut cups contained the milkberry wine, or even the more strongly brewed berry mead. Soren could not really say this in front of Primrose, for she had not been included in this adventure, and he must be careful about Martin and Ruby as well. They had decided that it should only be their original band and Eglantine who went on this mission to Silvervale. But, in truth, Soren was having serious doubts about Eglantine. The plan for getting away was fairly simple. At a certain point, well into the evening, the dancing would move outside among the branches. It would be easier to slip away then. They planned to go, if possible, one by one, and meet at the cliffs on the far side of the island. Owls very seldom went to that side of the island, for it lengthened any journey across the Sea of Hulamir. But the wind this evening was light and favorable, so it might not lengthen their crossing by too much. The evening, however, seemed to drag on and on. Owls were getting tipsy, but would the dancing ever spill over to outside? Odalus had come up and insisted on a dance with Soren. He didn't even like to dance. He felt awkward and stupid. It wasn't like flying at all, even though it was done in the air. Now Odalus had taken it on herself to instruct him in this silly dance called the Glock Glock. Look, Soren, it's not that hard. It's 1, 2, Glock Glock Glock. Then backwards, 1, 2, Glock Glock Glock. Odalus was batting her eyes and shaking her tail feathers. Great Glocks. Was she flirting with him? Suddenly he had an idea. If she was flirting with him, he might as well use it to his advantage. You know, Odalissa, I think I could do this better if we were outside. Oh, that's an idea. Now, hopefully others would follow. Twilight was doing the Glock Glock with another great gray, and Soren caught his eye. Twilight, always a quick study, steered his partner outside, following Soren. Others began to fly out of the great hollow and weave their way through the branches in the Glock Glock dance. Now Eglantine was coming with another spotted owl. Perfect, Soren thought. He knew that Odalissa had a crush on that particular spotted owl, whom Eglantine now had as her dance partner. He came from a lineage as ancient and distinguished as Odalissa's own. Soren managed to glock, glock, glock across the air and through some branches to where the spotted owl and Eglantine were dancing. May I cut in and have a dance with my own sister? When Odalissa saw with whom she was about to be partnered, she nearly swooned midair. Soren danced Eglantine off toward Gylfie and Digger, who were dancing with each other. Digger had a lot of smooth moves for being such a great walker, as all burrowing owls were. He combined these with flight maneuvers in a unique way. Watch this, Soren. I do the Glock Glock with a 4-4 beat. It's incredible. It's like the Glock Glock squared. Ready, Gylf? Ready, Diggy? Diggy. This was too much. Have they all been drinking? Listen, Soren said sharply. I think it'll be time to go soon. Everybody's pretty much in their cups from the look of it. I'll say, said Twilight, flying up to them without his partner. Madame Plonk has passed out. Passed out? The others gasped. Oh, I've got to see this, said Gylfie. Before Soren could stop her, the others had followed. Sure enough, just inside the great hollow, in a niche in one of the galleries, were a huge pile of white feathers. There was a huge pile of white feathers. Octavia, who served as a nestmaid to both Madame Plonk and Iselribe, was slithering along the gallery toward her, muttering about how Madame couldn't hold her berry wine, and it was always this way. But just at that moment there came a roar from outside, and then "Ah! The comet!" someone cried, and its red light seemed to flare for a brief moment and spill into the hollow, casting a fiery glow over everything. Madame Plonk's feathers shimmered red, and just in the same instant, Octavia, who had been nursing Madame Plonk, swung her head toward Soren. The old blind snake seemed to look right through him. Does she know? Does she know what we are planning, and that this might be connected with Iselribe? A shiver ran through Soren. All right, it's time, he whispered to the others. I'll leave first, then Eglantine, then Gylfie, next Digger, and last Twilight. See you at the cliffs. With that, Soren swept from the great hollow, but the entire time until the moss curtains parted, he felt the eyeless gaze of Octavia boring into him. Outside, the night seemed tinged with red. The moon, still newing, was just a sliver slipping over the horizon. In the light of the comet, it looked like a battle claw dripped in blood. Chapter 8. Into a Night Stained Red. Where's Eglantine? Soren said in a taunt voice. She was supposed to leave right after me. All the other owls had arrived at the cliff except Eglantine. Do you think she's gotten frightened? Soren asked. Maybe she's got caught? Gylfie offered. Oh, Glocks, I hope not, Soren sighed. He wondered how long they should wait. I hear something, Digger said suddenly. Owls were unusually silent flyers. All owls, that is, except for certain ones like pygmy and elf owls, who did not have the soft fringes called plummels at the leading edges of their flight feathers. The wing beats that Digger heard were the unmistakable sound of Primrose. Soren knew it in an instant, for he had flown behind her many a time in navigation class. What in the name of Glocks was Primrose doing here? Eglantine, along with Primrose, slid off the cliff and perched beside Soren. I know what you're going to say, Soren, she blurted out breathlessly, but he said it anyway. Primrose, what are you doing here? The pygmy owl shyly looked down at her talons. I wanted to come, Soren. You helped me when I came out to the great tree. You stayed with me all that first night, the night I lost my parents, my hollow, my tree, and the eggs. Primrose's parents had gone off to help out in some borderland skirmishes. They thought that she and the eggs would be safe, but a forest fire had broken out in their absence. Primrose had been rescued by owls from Ga'Hoole, but she had never seen her parents again. The truth, however, was that Primrose was from Silverville, and Soren sensed that she wanted to go back to see if perhaps she could find her parents. This could be a distraction from their mission. Primrose, Soren fixed the little owl in the shine of his dark eyes. I know what you're going to say, Soren. Everyone seemed to know what he was going to say, Soren thought, so why did he bother even saying it? I'm not going to look for my parents. They're dead, I know it. How do you know it? Gylfi asked. Do you remember the night after Trader Mags came last summer? Soren would never forget that night, for it was the first night that Eglantine had really been back to her old self after being rescued. It had been a beautiful summer night, and then, as if in celebration of his sister's return, the sky had blossomed with colors like he had never seen before. It was the night of the Aurora Glaucora, and all the owls had flown in and out of the colors that throbbed and billowed in the sky. Of course I remember that night. It was a night to remember for several reasons. One of the least happy was because on that night it had been confirmed that Isilraib had disappeared. But in the ecstasy of the shifting colors of the sky, Soren had actually willed himself not to think about his favorite teacher. Well, I remember it too, because that was the night that I saw the screams of my parents, Primrose said. What? They all guessed. You saw your parents' screams? Gylfi asked, and they seemed to be an ache embedded deep in her voice. For although she knew that Soren had returned much saddened by this encounter with his parents' screams, there was something in Gylfi, just as there had been in Eglantine, that longed for one last glimpse. Yes, replied Primrose. I saw them that night as we were flying through the colors of the Aurora Glaucora. Did they have unfinished business here on Earth? Soren asked, wondering to himself just how much unfinished scroom business they could manage on one mission. Not really, she paused. Well, I suppose you could say that I was their last piece of unfinished business. They wanted me to know that during the forest fire, they knew that I had tried my best to save the eggs. They just said that there was nothing to forgive. They were proud of me. That was their unfinished business, to let me know they were proud of me. There was a deep silence in the night as Primrose started to explain. You see, Soren, my encounter was not at all like yours. I didn't really get to talk with my parents in that strange wordless way that you described to Eglantine. Soren looked sharply at his sister. Why had she gone and told Primrose all this? It was much different. How? Soren said, genuinely perplexed. See, my parents were in Glamora. What? Soren said in disbelief. How do you know that? I saw them there. They saw me. They were happy. They knew I had done my best for the eggs that never hatched. They weren't angry. They knew that I was in a good place, a place they had never quite believed in, but they know is real. And I suddenly became so happy. It was like a river of happiness and peace flowing between us out there in the Aurora Glaucora. Primrose's voice was barely a whisper now. A river of happiness, Soren said softly. No words about Metalbeak, no words at all, just happiness. He tried to imagine his parents and a river of happiness flowing between them and himself and Eglantine. Then he jerked himself back from such reveries. What he had to say next was going to be very difficult. He was going to have to refuse to have Primrose and Eglantine on this mission. Primrose, there will be a time when we will need you and Eglantine, he paused. What? Eglantine was stunned. You're not taking me. You promised, she whined. Eglantine, you are not ready. You proved this tonight by blabbing to Primrose. He then spun his head toward Primrose. Primrose, you are certainly ready, but it is our decision that the fewer the better on this mission. The less chance that will be missed if it is just us. I understand, Soren. Don't apologize. But what about me? Eglantine whined again. I'm your sister. Yes, and someday you will be stronger. Stronger in Wing and stronger in Gizzard. And we shall need you, and you shall be included. Eglantine's wings dropped by her side. Her black eyes seemed to swim with the reflected lights of stars. We must prepare to go now, Soren said. Good luck, Primrose said in a full, strong voice. Be careful. Yes, be careful, Soren, Eglantine said softly. Eglantine, don't be mad. A promise is a promise. When you're ready, we'll both know it. I could never be mad at you, Soren. Never. I know, he replied softly. Soren looked to the south. The wake of the comet was still visible, but it made for a strange light in the sky, a light that could be deceiving. He would have Twilight, whose vision for marginal conditions like these was renowned, fly in the point position. Ready for takeoff? Twilight, fly point, Gylfie port side. I'll fly starboard, Digger, fly tail. They lifted off into the strangely colored night. Why was the night stained red? When he had first seen the comet a few weeks before, it had appeared red because it was dawn, and the sun was just rising. But now it was night, and there was no rising sun. It gave Soren the shivers to think about it. And the more he did, the more the sky looked not simply rusty, but like blood. And there was another curious phenomenon. The wind was a light-head wind and should have slowed them down, but indeed it was the reverse. It seemed as if the comet had cleared a path, created a vacuum through which they passed easily. It was as if they were being pulled instead. He was supposed to be a leader of this band, but where was he leading them, and what were they being pulled toward? Suddenly, the night seemed ominous to Soren. He felt something cold and quivering deep in his gizzard. Chapter 9. The Rogue Smith of Silvervale. Dawn was breaking. They had been flying over Silvervale for what seemed like hours, scouring the landscape below for any sign of smoke. It was the smoke that had led them to the cave of the dying barred owl so many months before. Do you think we'll ever find her? Do you think we'll ever find him? Soren called across from his starboard position. Her, Gylfie said. It's a her. Oh, sorry, I just can't get used to a female as a blacksmith. Well, get used to it, Gylfie said somewhat testily. Rotate position, Soren called out. Let's look for a rest spot. Crows will be up soon. We don't want a mobbing. Soren, Gylfie, Twilight, and Digger had been mobbed once before on their way to the great Ghoul tree. It was not an experience they wished to repeat. Digger had been seriously injured. Owls flying in the daytime are not safe, except perhaps over water. Crows have a system for alerting other crows to the owl's presence and can come upon them in a swarm, often pecking out their eyes, stabbing them from beneath, and making their wings collapse. In the night, it is quite the reverse. Then it is the owls who can mob the crows. Just as Soren was about to take over to the point position, Twilight spotted a big fir tree below, perfect for fetching up for a day's sleep. Fir tree below. Soren's gizzard gave a small twitch. It was a fir tree just like the one in which he and Eglantine had been hatched and had spent a brief childhood with their parents. There were countless little ceremonies, rites of passage, that marked the development of a young owl. And because of his snatching and whatever it was that had happened to Eglantine when she had fallen from the nest or perhaps been pushed by Clud, the two young owls had missed many of these. Whenever Soren mentioned this in front of the others, they all seemed quite sympathetic, except for Twilight. Twilight had been orphaned at such a young age that he had no nest memories and prided himself on having actually skipped such folderal ceremonies, as he referred to them. Not the most modest of owls, he bragged about having learned it all on his own in what he called the orphan school of tough learning, which, frankly, became quite a bore to the others. The fragrance of the fir needles filled Soren with a great sense of longing. He yearned for his parents, not the Scrooms, but his real live parents. Soren could not let himself give in to these feelings. Before we take a snooze, we have to plan. Action, Soren always felt, was the best remedy for sad feelings. I've been thinking that when we met the barred owl, he was not just on a border, he was really on a point where the corners of 4 borders touched, those of Kinnear, Umballa, the Beaks, and Tyto. A convergence point? Gylfie offered. Yes, I think we should look for such a point of convergence. Gylfie, you're the navigator. You've studied the map. Which way should we head? Well, for our convergence, we need to head toward the point where Silvervale, the Shadow Forest, and the Barrens meet, Gylfie said. Tonight, when the constellations of the Great Glocks rises, we have to fly 2 degrees off the westerly wing, just between that and the claw of the little raccoon. All right, everyone get a good rest. We'll leave at first black, Soren said. 3 hours after first black, they had still seen nothing. They had been in the region of the convergence for 2 hours. Soren told himself he could not get discouraged. He was the leader of this band. If the owls sensed that he was discouraged, then their spirits too would begin to fall. They could not fail. Too much was at stake. Digger flew up to Soren. Permission for low-level surveillance, Soren? What for? Tracking, Soren. I'm used to low-level flight for fighting down owls and anything else on the ground. Look at me. We blend in with everything, desert sand and fallen leaves in autumn. And I can fly slow, really slow. Noisy, but slow. And he paused. I can walk. All right, but I expect you back within a quarter hour. Yes, Captain. Captain? He wanted to cry out. Don't call me Captain. Only Easelride can be called Captain. Soren watched as Digger went into a plunging dive. As he neared the ground, Digger began a slow survey, first for any sign of caves or scattered coals that might indicate the presence of a rogue smith. When he found no caves, he wondered if the blacksmith would ever build a fire in a clearing. Possibly. Then, of course, there was the fact that this blacksmith was a snowy owl, pure white. She should certainly show up on a night like this, with the moon far from full and still just newing. The night was very black, perfect for seeing white. The quarter of an hour was running out. Digger became more determined than ever, more intense in his search, scanning by rotating his head, as he had been taught to do in tracking. He dodged bushes, tree trunks, rocks, and other ground obstacles just in the nick of time. He sensed them almost before he got to them, but he hadn't sensed the large black mound ahead, neither rock nor shrub nor trunk. The mound suddenly sprung to life. Watch where you're going, idiot! Digger's gizzard froze. Rock drops. Another scream from the mound. Digger felt something soft, and then there was a small blizzard of sooty particles. He tumbled head over talons, and the smoldering cloud seemed to follow him. They were rolling down a small incline. Glocks almighty, you splat-brained idiot! A scathing rant rang out. Digger had never heard such a stream of swears. The vilest curses scalded the night air and rained down on his ears. Bubbo was no match. Great stinking glocks, I might have known a burrowing owl with most likely a small burrow where your brain should be. What happened? Did you fall out of it? I beg your rock-dropped pardon, you wretched piece of wet poop. Digger drew himself up to his full height. He surprised himself with his own swearing. Wet poop! I'll splat you! This isn't working, Digger suddenly thought. He could not stand here trading insults with the sooty black thing. Truth, he said. The creature stopped and stood still. Who are you? What are you? Digger asked. A bird, you darned fool. A bird. An owl. A snowy at that. Snowy! Digger gasped and nearly laughed out loud. You are the blackest snowy I have ever seen. What did you expect? I'm a blacksmith, idiot. It was music to Digger's ears. A blacksmith, he said, his voice drenched in awe and relief. The rogue smith of Silvervale. Digger asked softly, What business is that of yours? You want battle claws? I rarely make them for burrowing owls. They're lousy flyers. It's a waste. Digger swallowed his anger at the insult. No, Bubbo told us about you. Bubbo! The owl suddenly exploded. You're from Grahul. Bubbo sent you here. Not exactly. What does that mean? Snowy narrowed her eyes until they were 2 yellow slits. I'd better go get my friends, Digger stammered, and quickly took off. I think that is where we will stop for the night. I hope everyone enjoyed listening, and I hope you have a good evening and a good night.